All right, guys, for today's read aloud, we're going to knock out a couple shorter chapters, so there'll be about 3 or 4. And that's going to set the scene for tomorrow, which should be a pretty exciting moment in the book where I don't want to give too much away, but we're going to try to get there by tomorrow. So, chapter 25 is called Lifeline, and we're back with Wendy. The ornithopter's motor was coughing more now. Sometimes it belched 3 or 4 times, the big feather wings jerking in hesitation before finally the engine roared back to life. Each time this happened, Wendy worried the engine might not come back. Her mood was not helped by her discomfort. Her legs ached from standing on the tiny platform. Her hands ached from gripping the ornithopter's control levers. She was thoroughly cold now, shivering almost constantly in the chill, damp ocean air. She had managed to eat some bread and cheese, but when she tried to drink some of the water, the bottle had slipped from her aching hand and fallen into the sea far below. Again and again she peered ahead, blinking into the rushing wind, searching the horizon for the dark shape of land. And again she only saw the dark green sea stretching away. Her only reassurance came from the sight of the porpoises. Thank goodness there was always one below her, and always another one waiting for her ahead. The day was cloudy, so most of the time she could not tell the location of the sun nor her direction of travel. From what glimpses of the sun she did manage, she figured the porpoises were now leading her southwest. Uncle Neville had guessed that the motor had 3 or 4 hours worth of fuel, and Wendy didn't know exactly how long she'd been in the air for, but she was quite sure it was already longer than 4 hours. She glanced constantly at the fuel tank, each time patting the locket around her neck. The engine coughed again, this time longer than ever, and when it started up, the roar was more of a sputter. Then it was coughing more. The wings hesitated and jerked. The ornithopter, though still flapping, started to descend. This is it, thought Wendy. She leaned forward and grabbed the filler cap on top of the fuel tank. She gave it a counterclockwise twist, but the cap did not budge. The engine coughed again, and this time it kept coughing. The ornithopter, its wings beating very slowly now, began descending at a steeper angle. Fighting panic, Wendy gripped the cap and twisted as hard as she could. It still wouldn't come off. She let go of the control lever and put both hands on the filler cap. The engine sputter was more of a silence than combustion now. Out of the corners of her eyes, Wendy saw the dark sea below drawing closer and closer. She gritted her teeth and with a desperate grunt, yanked the cap, and this time it opened. The engine stopped, belched, and sputtered again even more weakly. Wendy could hear the waves below. She spun the cap off, tucked it in the pocket of her coat, and she braced herself against the ornithopter frame. With cold, stiffened fingers, she reached behind her. What do you think she's looking for? The locket. She reached behind her and fumbled with the clasp of her locket. The waves' tops were near. From somewhere below came the urgent chitter of a porpoise. Up, up! The engine wheezed and shuddered violently, clearly about to die. And with a jerk, Wendy pulled the locket from her neck, breaking the chain. She leaped forward, holding the locket toward the fuel tank's opening, and with her thumb, she flicked open the locket. Instantly, the air was filled with light, and in fact, her desperate predicament aside, she felt wonderful. The source of this feeling was a radiant golden sphere of light, now wrapping the locket around her hand and infusing her whole body with a sense of calm and well-being. And that melodious sound, what was it? Bells? Up, up. The urgent warning brought her back into the moment, and she saw the porpoise now directly below her, only yards away. The sputtering ornithopter was in free fall, its wings barely moving. Forcing herself to concentrate, Wendy tilted the locket over the fuel tank. A thin stream of golden light poured into the hole. A second later, the sputtering engine came to life, but this time, instead of the clackety roar she had been listening to for hours, it emitted a smooth, almost pleasant hum. Wendy snapped the locket closed and with one hand pulled the lever. The ornithopter responded instantly, swooshing upward, its big wings beating powerfully. And as it rose, Wendy carefully pushed the locket down into her coat pocket. She retrieved the fuel cap and tightened it over the tank opening. The ornithopter, its motor humming happily, continued rising swiftly and easily. Soon Wendy was again soaring high above the limitless sea. Below and well behind her was the porpoise that had warned her to stay up. She waved, and the porpoise leaped in response, then was gone. Wendy looked ahead and found her next guide waiting patiently. She allowed herself a tiny smile, and as she hoped, the star stuff had helped keep her in the air. She also felt fantastic. The warmth was still filling her. She had a vibrant energy that replaced her exhaustion. But how long would it last? She could already feel the effects of the star stuff diminishing, and in time she would have to pour more into the fuel tank. How soon would that be? How much star stuff was left in the locket? How far away was the island, and what would she do when night fell? How would she see her porpoise guides, assuming she made it to nighttime? As each new question popped into Wendy's mind, her confidence diminished. She put her hand into her pocket and gripped the locket, feeling its reassuring warmth. Her eyes went back to the horizon, searching for a hint, a promise of land. She saw nothing. She tightened her grip on the locket, her lifeline, her only hope. We're on to chapter 26, which is called Tug of War, and we're back on Pirates Cove. Pirates Cove looked like a giant spider web. Arranged around its shore were 11 pulleys, some suspended from palm trees, others from ropes. Connecting all these ropes, strung through the pulleys and coming together in the middle, where the mollusk divers had tied the ropes together on the sailing ship Devliegen. The ship, which had a huge hole in its hull, had sat on the bottom for more than 20 years with its only masts sticking out of the water. From the shore, a cry went out, "All hands prepare to heave!" This was followed by a similar command in mollusk language, which loosely translated to, "Pull until you grunt like a warthog." Hook and Fighting Prawn's longtime enemies were brought together for this effort, and they stood side by side on a tall rock overlooking the water. Surrounding the cove were the mollusks and the pirates working side by side, but wary of each other, as were their leaders. The men had formed into groups and were gripping the ropes with calloused hands, the same hands that had spent days rigging the massive network of pulleys. "On three?" Hook asked Prawn. It was understood the pirates and mollusk warriors would take orders from only their leader. "On one," Prawn corrected, as this was the mollusk system. Before Hook could argue, Fighting Prawn counted 3, 2, 1. And on one, both men raised their arms and shouted in their separate languages for their men to go to work. The men pulled, the ropes tightened, the palm trees bowed, the pulleys creaked and cried, the men grunted and dug their heels into the sand. It was like they were locked in a giant game of tug-of-war. For several excruciatingly long seconds, nothing happened. The only signs of the intense effort were the concentric circles of ripples dancing around the taut ropes. The pulleys groaned. "It ain't moving," said Hook. "Your men need to pull harder." Fighting Prawn shot a look at Hook but said nothing. And then, bubbles. Just a few at first, but then the cove was boiling with them. The water became milky, there was clumps of seaweed mingling with clouds of sand, and then, slowly, the masts wobbled and began to rise. The main deck railing poked through the surface, and then came a great rushing sound as the ship's deck appeared, water cascading off the sides. There the ship seemed to waver, the dripping ropes trembling with the strain of holding the massive weight of the ship. One of the pulleys broke. Pieces of it whistled over the ship. 2 men, 1 pirate, 1 mollusk, collapsed. Urged by Hook and Fighting Prawn, the other men kept heaving on the ropes, backing step by agonizing step away from the water, up the beach toward the jungle. And with each step, more of the ship's dripping hull appeared. Finally, the hole in the hull was visible. Water was gushing from it as it cleared the cove surface. Now they could patch it up. Fighting Prawn and Hook ordered the men to stop. The ropes were tied off to trees, and a cheer rang over the cove. And the men fell silent as they got their first good look at the ship that had been mostly underwater for 2 decades. It looked in really good shape. There was a bit of slime on the hull, and there were fish flopping on the deck, but except for the hole, the ship looked sound, almost like brand new. None of the wood had rotted, not even the smallest piece of rail. More incredible, all of its rigging was still intact. Every pulley, every rope. Only the sails were missing. Now you probably know why the ship is in that good of condition. "That ain't possible," said Hook. "A ship can't look like this after sitting on the bottom." "A ship can't fly either," said Fighting Prawn. Hook would never admit it, but the mollusk chief had a point. Devliegen had once carried a huge quantity of star stuff, which had enabled it to fly across the ocean. The star stuff had fallen out and dumped into the island's water. It had clearly left the ship permanently changed. "So she will sail again," said Fighting Prawn. "Devliegen," he said as he read the name carved in the ship's transom. "Oh, she'll sail again, and soon, but not as Devliegen." Fighting Prawn raised a questioning eyebrow. "It's a pirate ship," said Hook. "Her name is the Jolly Roger." And from high above the cove, on the side of the steep mountain, Cheeky O'Neill, Frederick DeWolf, Rufus Kelly, and Angus McPherson had watched the raising of the ship. They did it! I didn't think they could, but they did. O'Neill, his eyes on the ship, nodded. How long do you think it's going to take them to repair it? Said Kelly. It shouldn't take long. Dripping wet, she looks like she just came out of the yard. Look at that rigging. She appears to have only been underwater maybe a day or two. Any of you want to explain this to me? There's a lot on this island that can't be explained, said Kelly. Looks like they're already getting ready to start with the repairs, said McPherson. Guess they really want us off this island. What happens if they finish the repairs before we're ready, said Kelly. He addressed the question to O'Neill. All eyes were on the big man, waiting for the answer. O'Neill continued staring at the ship for a few more seconds. When he spoke, his voice was a deep, determined rumble. Doesn't matter what they want, we stick to our plan. With a glare at the other three, he spit on the ground and started back up the ridge. So that's the end of that chapter. You're probably wondering what O'Neill and the guys are up to. The authors aren't telling you, and that's on purpose because they want you to try to piece together what they're up to. And for right now, you just kind of have to keep guessing. Chapter 27 is called The Last Bit. It is a short chapter. Next two are short. Dusk had turned the gloomy sky a darker shade of gray, and Wendy knew that night would come soon. She peeled ahead, feeling the familiar brief pang of anxiety until she caught sight of the next porpoise. How many had there been? Wendy had lost count. Her legs were aching. She reckoned she had been standing for at least 12 hours. The porpoises had led her many miles south. The air was distinctively warmer now, and Wendy was hardly comfortable. Aside from being exhausted, she was hungry. She finished the last of her bread and cheese. Her throat was dry, and she thought she had lost her water bottle. But what bothered her the most was not the hunger, the thirst, it was the worry. 3 times the engine had suddenly dropped, and the ornithopter slowed down. Each time Wendy quickly unscrewed the fuel tank and opened the locket and poured some more in. Each time the motor came back to life. But the last time this happened, the flow of star stuff had been barely a trickle. When Wendy had snapped the locket shut, she wasn't sure there was anything at all left inside. She would find out soon enough. The sky was much darker now, and Wendy gently pushed the altitude lever, nosing the ornithopter down so she could fly closer to the sea. Her eyes were fixed on the porpoise currently guiding her. She could barely see its gray body. Wendy passed over the guide porpoise, straining to see through the gloomy darkness. She found the next one, and with each passing minute, the sky grew darker. She took the ornithopter lower, then lower still. She passed over her guide and anxiously searched the water. The darkness was almost total now. Where was the next porpoise? And she saw it, a strange greenish glow in the sea ahead. She swooped closer and realized that the glow was coming from the water itself. It had formed a V by the wake of the next porpoise, which was barely visible. When she passed over it, Wendy saw another ghostly V. Oh, she was grateful that the water was glowing. She passed from V to V, and the motor hummed. And then the hum sank to a lower pitch. Wendy frantically tried to unscrew the fuel cap. She was close to the water and couldn't afford to let the ornithopter descend much farther. She reached into her coat pocket, pulled out the locket, and held it over the fuel tank. With a silent prayer, she flicked it open. There was a momentary flash of golden light, raising Wendy's hopes, but they fell immediately when the glow flickered and dimmed. Wendy shook the last bit of star stuff into her fuel tank. The engine resumed. Then it died. Its wings stopped. The ornithopter began descending rapidly. Wendy pulled back hard on the altitude lever, and the ornithopter swooped up a few feet. It stalled and went into a downward spiral. Wendy fought to control it, but the levers were useless. She was going into the ocean. She looked down in panic, but in the darkness she couldn't see anything. Then she heard the rushing water. With the sound of cracking wood, the ornithopter slammed into the sea. Wendy felt a stab pain as her head struck the ornithopter frame. Before she could hold her breath, she was dragged underwater. Dazed by the blow to her head, she took several seconds to understand that her coat was caught in the wreckage on the frame. She was being dragged down by the weight of the motor. She kicked furiously, blindly into the black water. She felt her coat rip. Suddenly, she was no longer going down. Her lungs were burning, thrashing in the water, struggling to swim to the surface. But she didn't know which way that was. She felt pressure on both sides, and she began to move swiftly. It was the porpoises. A few seconds later, Her head broke the surface. She gasped for breath, coughed up salt water, and gasped some more. There were porpoises all around her now, holding her up, protecting her. Others swam close by, chittering and squeaking. Wendy tried to understand them, but she couldn't concentrate. She felt dazed, confused. Her head throbbed viciously. She reached up to touch her scalp and recoiled as her fingers found a deep gash. She had blood trickling down her forehead and into her eyes. She needed to find out where she was, where the island was, whether she would live. She tried to concentrate, to remember her porpoise vocabulary, but nothing came to her. She felt an overwhelming sense of fatigue. She struggled to keep her eyes open. I can't fall asleep, she thought. Not here. I can't. Her eyes closed and her body went limp. The porpoises repositioned themselves under her. Others formed a protective ring around her. Then they began moving, taking the waves as gently as they could, painstakingly, keeping Wendy afloat, while her hand dragged lifelessly in the sea. And that's the end of that chapter. Sorry about that cough. The next chapter is 28. It's called One Last Push.